Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Bhide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This is a module on critical community practice again, but where we review organizations, practices and practitioners, which means that from the conceptual world of understanding critical community practice, we now come down to a practical level and beginning to understand how organizations have actually engaged with critically community practice. And here too, I'm going to begin really with a review of how critical community practice originated in the UK, how has this concept been thought of in that context, and then I will elaborate on a few case examples in India to delineate for you both the specific contexts of oppression and then how critical community practice has actually emerged. If you look at the entire context, why we are looking at this difference between the UK and in India, basically critical community practice in India, in my view, has had a very long and a very diverse history. And this long history and practices really range from social movements to struggles to a search for what are the alternate routes for social transformation. And also, given the diversity of groups in India, the ways in which systemic oppression has actually manifested in India, we also see that the practices to challenge this have also been very diverse and they have been culturally rooted. So, the practice models in the West and the practice models in India are extremely different. So let's first look at where the theory has actually appeared first, which is in the West, and where Lena Dominelli began to first talk about the idea of anti-oppressive social work. And this anti-oppressive social work for her is basically a challenge which requires new ethics for this caring profession of social work. Why is this required? Because for her the entire context of the world is changing, especially in the UK, where there are new identity politics which is emerging. The entire distance between clients and then social work, who is regarded as a social worker, who is seen as a neutral kind of a professional, that relationship has begun to change. So that is the context within which Lena Dominelli actually talks about critical community practice or anti-oppressive social work per se. Bute Butcher talks about, and his perhaps is the most recent book on this subject, and where he conceptualizes critical community practice as comprising three components. One is critical consciousness, critical action and critical theorizing. And where again I think it's important to note that action has to be backed up by consciousness and by theorizing. So both of these are necessary. In earlier modules, we have looked at some of these concepts and theorizing, and now we are actually coming to the practice part. Now, this practice part of critical community practice is something which is an ongoing mode. In fact, Hugh Butcher uses a very interesting term where he calls it as permanent white water. Permanent white water is water in the rapids, which is constantly churning and twirling and increasing and emerging in waves. It is not, and it's very turbulent kind of a thing. It's not characterized as one calm, set mode of practice, and one has to understand this. What critical community practice involves is an ongoing experimentation in contexts which are turbulent, which are dynamic, highly dynamic, and perhaps because of the modes of challenging exploitation, there are so many interplays of power which are happening, that this churning is something which is essential, and this churning has to happen at multiple levels, at a self level, personal level of organizers, it has to also happen within organizations, and it also has to happen in the entire relationship between the different communities who are oppressed and the organizers themselves. And therefore, we are going to look at all of these dimensions when we look at cases. Another kind of theorizing in the West, again which is very important, is to basically, these are people who have looked at critical community practice as one of the strains in an overall ethos of community practice. So there are multiple forms of community work, within which radical community work is something which is one typology of that community work. So basically, Alan Tweltrees, for example, looks at radical community work as a form of practice which has its own distinct principles. Okay? And these distinct principles again revolve around how you understand and analyze the context, the kind of strategies of change, the relationship of the practitioner to that actual context, and so on and so forth, which perhaps now Butcher would put in as critical theorizing, critical action, and critical theory, critical action, and critical thought. Yeah. So now coming to India, as I said, I'm basically asserting that in India, critical practice perhaps has had an even longer tradition than in the West. And this is basically because the West has largely been associated with the rise of the welfare state, the incorporation of care, and community work therefore has become part of that practice of the state itself, right? And therefore, when it becomes part of the state, there are ways in which you relate with all the state power which is also embedded within the practitioners of community work and the way they relate to their clients. On the other hand, in India, social work basically has emerged much more strongly in relation to the voluntary sector, which is extremely diverse. Okay? And therefore, there is much greater complexity to it. There are thoughts which have moved ahead which I will illustrate through the examples, and then we will draw conclusions on the base of it. But I would see that critical community practice in India can be seen really in three phases. These three phases, basically one is what I call as the deepening of democracy and the challenging of the post-colonial Indian state. After we became independent in 1947, we were a country with a legacy of a colonial regime which had brought in some ways and created a legal nationhood, which had perhaps also established some basic infrastructure which connected the state. But on the other hand, this was also a regime which had tremendously exploited the resources of the country. It had also created a state whose institutions basically did not exist for the development of the people in this country, but were designed to actually control the nation's population. And all of this, so while there was a lot of hope associated with Indian independence, by the 1960s and 70s, it began to be realized that several groups are actually left out of the entire dream of democracy. So if Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had talked about a tryst with destiny, it seemed like this tryst with destiny was an extremely frustrating journey. In fact, the youth of the country, especially around the 1960s, late 1960s and 70s, were so disenchanted with the overall rise of poverty and inequality, and more importantly, the inability of macro institutions like the state and the market to solve and respond to these issues. Then additionally, of course, there was also the trigger of the emergency and the state repression which was associated with this. So as a result, in this period, we basically see the emergence of a phenomenon which is called the non-party political organization. So what were these non-party political organizations? These non-party political organizations were basically attempts to deepen in some ways democracy, reach out to the excluded groups, and then begin new forms of organization where people began to speak through their own voice. I'll speak with an illustration. And I think this is a very interesting case study. I'm not giving you all the names, and there are identities which have been really withheld but this is the study of a organization of rather, I would say, a young middle class woman called Surekha, who basically began engaging with a voluntary organization which worked with rural development effort in one of the districts in Maharashtra in the 1980s. Now, when she started working with this rural development organization, which was basically engaged with having farmers' camps, it formed their collectives, it marketed some of the agricultural goods, and Surekha started talking about adult literacy. She began to realize and met one day a group of brick kiln workers. And these brick kiln workers were basically working on the brick kilns, and they were getting wages which were extremely poor. A group of brick kiln workers met Surekha basically because their owners were not giving them even that less than minimum wage pay, and there was some conflict around that. They wanted Surekha to read their accounts. Okay? So the literacy class had actually resulted in a reading of accounts. The reading of accounts made Surekha realize that this kind of account keeping and the kind of wages which were being paid actually resulted in an overall labor relationship which would not give the Katkaris, a primitive tribe actually in Maharashtra, would not give them any gains at all. This was a system which was designed for exploitation. Okay? And when they went to the owners to ask for deferred wages, the owners just rejected them. Now, how does one combat this kind of exploitation? The Katkari tribal in this area, who was the original resident in this Raigad district, were a group of tribal who found themselves completely alienated from the overall development process. So on one hand, there was the Raigad district which was being industrialized, where new highways were being built. On the other hand, the Katkari tribals lost their access to forest, they had lost their access to lands, the lands which were even small lands which were given to them by during the British government and which they cultivated. They had lost access to that, and they were being driven increasingly into the forest, to which also they had very little claim. So there were forest officials, and these tribals then found themselves leading a lifestyle which was completely full of alcohol. They were the ones who were like 90% of the people in jails in Raigad district were actually Katkaris, extremely poor, migrating all the time and working then on these brick kilns. They were malnourished. So within this kind of a trap, how does one look at development? How does one look at challenging this kind of a development? What is the relevance of the state which was supposed to be developmental for these kind of people. So Surekha initiated a Sanghatan. A Sanghatan is a collective organization, and this collective organization began to mobilize the Khatkaris and gave them a strong voice to talk to brick kiln owners, to talk to state governments about specific schemes, go to the collector and begin to assert their control over the lands which were given to them by the British government. And this kind of a voice basically is a very, very important voice, and this was the form of practice in critical community practice in India, which emerged in the 1970s really. What are the characteristics of that kind of a phase? You basically see that critical community practice was initiated by people who were outsiders. They were young, educated, middle class youth who went to the contexts of exploitation and began this kind of a move where on one hand voluntary interventions, developmental interventions which get the form of rachana went hand in hand along with things which were agitational and which involved forming collectives which actually asked and challenged repression, which was called Sangharsh. So the merger of this rachana and Sangharsh is what characterized this critical community practice in the 1970s. But obviously you will see through this case that there are multiple questions which are also linked to this. The overall distance between those who were oppressed and the ones who were the practitioners, these are all issues of that time. We come to this next phase of critical community practice in India, and which is in the 1980s. By the 1980s, basically you see that developmentalization and statization had become the new realities. Developmentalization is where a particular concept of development as basically a state undertaking. Whatever is proposed by the state is equivalent to development. That people are not partners in development. People don't direct development. That development is also about tangible things, that it is also about economic things. This is what developmentalization means. And the second part is statization. Statization is basically where the state takes over and the state enters many new realms of life which were earlier governed by communities themselves. Okay? And this had become the new reality really in the 1980s. Also, the kind of expansion, gradual expansion of the voluntary sector, which had begun in the 1970s, by 1980s, voluntary sector became an entrenched phenomenon. So the government increasingly began to resort to the NGOs and to the voluntary sector for them to be taking on functions of the state. Okay? On the other hand, there were also therefore deeper inequalities. You found more complex forms of oppression, and at the same time, because of the statization that I talked about, the traditional forms of communities had started eroding, and this formed a very, very critical support, especially for the excluded communities. So there were new challenges which were emerging. So critical practice in this era in the 1980s was actually about challenging developmentalization and challenging NGOization. So in the first phase, if it was about deepening of the democracy and challenging the post-colonial state, in now it became challenging developmentalization and NGOization. There are new values which are sought and to be brought here. And that was that in that earlier phase, we basically saw that there was a gap between the urban educated class and the oppressed class. But in these new modes, there is a move towards seeing that the urban educated class and the oppressed class go working together laterally on one platform. Okay? One very interesting kind of a case study linked to this is that of the Resource Support and Center for Development. Now this resource support and Center for Development, it works with a whole lot of grassroots organizations in India. And while initially it started working as a forum which connected different NGOs to bring them together around issues of food security, it began to realize over a period of time that NGOs had actually become very strong mediators of development and had developed their own strong stakes around development. So there was stake there itself, and therefore they began to, I would say, transcend this kind of a barrier to development to move to directly grassroots organizations, developed a direct connect to people. And therefore, there was a network of women in villages, primarily comprising self-help groups, microcredit groups, women who were active in different politics in the villages through the expanding Panchayat Raj system. And this was the kind of form of organization, Mahila Rajsatta Andolan, which has been initiated by RSCD, is today a movement and a campaign which represents women who see politics as an arena for change. Okay, so politics is about decision making, a decision making which stretches from their own personal spaces to perhaps the spaces in the villages where decisions linked to village development are taken. Okay, and all of these women then connect directly together. Okay, and that's kind of a form of challenging and engaging both the state. Okay, and it has taken multiple forms. So it takes the forms of challenging, let's say, a practice like who hoists the flag in the Gram Panchayat on the Independence Day or on 26th January. And it used to happen basically that even though there was a woman sarpanch, then it is basically the male leaders in the village who would take over and hoist the flag. Okay? But with the launch of this kind of a campaign, women began to assert their authority. It also took the form of thinking about what constitutes development. One would see that male leaders in the village typically took decisions, only thought about roads, construction, building temples, building community centers, everything that involves kickbacks and construction. But women also began introducing newer agendas. For example, holding a women's melawa. Is that part of development and village development? Thinking about sanitation and bringing toilets on the village development agenda. These are huge contributions that this kind of a network has actually made, because it begins to challenge both the idea of what is development and who will participate in that development. I have seen through this organization efforts and campaigns which link to how does one run water schemes. Okay? Are water schemes, are developmental priorities only decided by the district level ministers or district level bureaucrats? Can people contribute and create something? And these forms of self-help, which necessarily don't always keep the state as the center of everything, are also things which these people have challenged. But besides just state-focused efforts, these are also about how do you change practices in the village which are linked to caste, which ensure that only certain caste groups are listened to in the village, that there are still going to be inequities which are economic, but on the other hand, these economic inequities need not necessarily reflect in the kind of social relations that transact in the village. And these groups are beginning to question a whole lot of these kind of practices themselves, and therefore I would very much consider this as part of the critical community practice of this era of the second phase. You will notice that there are challenges embedded in this form of practice as well, in this phase as well, because there are several contradictions here. You have a state which has increasingly becoming it is there, it is present all the while, but on the other hand, it is becoming very, very politicized. That these larger spaces of politics are ones from which the actual excluded groups are becoming distant. They are getting used in that process. The dynamics of development are getting complex. Within that, then community organizers are facing a challenge. If one is building a network and organization based on these poor women, I would say, across several rural areas, how does one sustain these kind of networks? Where do funds come from? Where do resources come from? Should we go to the state? Should we go to external funding agencies who may have their own agendas? And these are definitely these kind of challenges which are being faced as one kind of takes the task of democratization further and begins to challenge both NGOization as well as statization. In the more contemporary form, I would say some of these challenges have become even more complex. Even more complex because the state has become and considers now itself to be a powerful state. There are forms of exclusion where people are becoming marginalized in many, many different ways. Okay? And you would also see that there are realms from which the state is actually withdrawing, that there are forms which are now being corporatized, where corporates are being expected to take over. But on the other hand, corporates or CSRs, and you will see that corporate philanthropy has not completely evolved in the country. So the current regime and the current context is one which is full of multiple contradictions. So what happens? One basically begins to see that critical community practice has now started emerging and taking on these newer forms of challenges as well. Okay? And now I'm going to give you an instance of critical community practice which is happening in a very different space. This is a space which is right there in Mumbai. Mumbai, which is considered to be, like, in some ways, it is a very developed city. It is considered to be an icon for a global city in India. It's commercial capital in many ways. But within this icon, you also see that this is also a city where more than 60% of its population stays in slums and is very, very poor, right? Right to P campaign, I think, is a very interesting instance of critical community practice in this context. What is right to P? Right to P is a response which basically emerged as a response to the inadequacy of public toilets for women. Okay? Now you would say that this is such an innocuous kind of a demand. Why should one think about this as critical community practice? I want to basically talk a little bit about this. Okay? In a city, usually cities in India and elsewhere perhaps in the world are seen to be built around the principle of property. And when we begin to think about cities as being built around the principles of property, accompanied with another principle, which is the separation of work from residence. Okay? And within this kind of a context, then public space becomes basically a transitory, circulatory kind of a space. Okay? The imagination of everything that is not work or that is not residence is an interstitial kind of a imagination. It's left to the margins, it's not defined clearly. And within this context, what you actually see is when there are large numbers of poor people in the city, they derive their life, they derive their livelihood from these interstitial and marginal spaces. Therefore, there are scores of workers who are there on the street. There is a large presence of women on the street. Okay? Now where are the public toilets? Okay? And in the absence of these toilets, one begins to see that women in particular are forced to go through indignity and very experiences full of this indignity on an everyday basis and really challenge the rules of the city. Okay? Right to pee is an important demand and an important mobilization in this context. One would further see that there are much lesser number of toilets for women as opposed to men. In Mumbai, the practice was that men could pee for free, whereas women had to pay a rupee per use in all the public toilets. Okay? So right to pee has to be seen at all of these different levels. At once, it is a demand for seeing that public spaces become much friendlier, not just to women, but also to poor women. It is a demand for equity between men and women. And thirdly, it is a demand for looking at very, very pragmatic kind of demands that women have. Newer challenges, several. Because what one is seeing, while the outputs from this kind of a campaign are incorporated often by the state says yes to more public toilets. The state says, why don't you come on? It asks the campaign organizers and tries to almost co-opt them and say, you provide us the design. And then what happens to the larger demand? So there are always newer questions which actually emerge. Okay? I would suggest that critical community practice therefore demands a reflexivity on an ongoing basis. Does an organizer think of one's own interests, of an organization's interests? Does the organization, is that important, or is it actually people who are oppressed are important? How does one transcend person, organizer, organization, exploited people to actually begin to challenge systems of oppression? And therefore, I would suggest that this Indian practice in all of these different phases, the kind of challenges, the kind of questions that it is raising have actually gone on deepening, and it is much more in some ways advanced and linked to the overall politics of transformation than perhaps the practice in the West, which has just now begun to explore and engage even with the notion of what critical community practice is. Thank you. For references in this module, please look at Lena Dominelli's work, Hugh Butcher's work, but there are also very, very interesting case studies which have been developed in different parts of the country. In all of these different phases, there are multiple books and experiences that you can refer to. And the opening for that has been given in the text.